This conference will now be recorded.
And then we will turn it over to Dr. Chris Ashworth, who will walk us through the beef cattle research that we're going to talk about. So first of all, we'll just do a quick overview of the webinar, what our objective here this afternoon is. Number one, we want to share some new and existing research that demonstrates the health and production benefits of feeding performance trace minerals throughout all phases of cattle production. We're going to discuss how beef cattle producers can achieve production and performance improvements by feeding 7 grams of performance trace minerals. And our agenda is going to be, we're going to provide a brief overview of Zinpro. We're going to address some housekeeping items. I'll introduce our speaker, Dr. Chris Ashworth. He will walk us through the research reviews, and then we're going to have time for questions following his presentation. So, brief overview of Zinpro. Zinpro is a leader in performance trace mineral nutrition. More than 45 years ago, Zinpro pioneered the research and development of organic performance trace minerals to improve animal wellness and performance. Zinpro is a family-owned and privately held company, has regional sales offices in 11 countries, and markets its products in more than 70 countries. Zinpro invests more in animal performance studies, 244 peer-reviewed publications to be exact, than all other organic trace mineral companies. And just to provide you an overview, so far in the company's 45-year history, Zinpro has conducted 45 peer-reviewed publications in the beef cattle market alone, covering all phases of production, whether that's reproduction, weaning, backgrounding, as well as in the feedlot. So let's jump into our housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please send them to me via the chat message function. And then at the same time, too, if you have questions as we're going along, just feel free to chat those to me, and I will write those down, and we will address those at the end of Chris's presentation. The presentation will be emailed immediately following the conclusion of the webinar, as well as a link to the recording of the webinar. And then other materials you will see will include some graphics that are in the presentation. We're going to send you an infographic on the use of performance trace minerals year-round in beef nutrition, some fact sheets, and one-page summaries of some of the research that is cited in the presentation. And if you are tweeting, we'd encourage you to utilize hashtag #BeefLifetimePerformance. And at the end of the webinar, if you would like to get additional information, you can go to essentialfeed.zinpro.com for additional information on performance trace minerals and beef cattle nutrition, as well as information on heat stress, gut integrity. We have about 70 articles on the Essential Feed blog that deal with livestock nutrition. So next, without any further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Chris Ashworth. He is the global RNS species leader for beef. Dr. Ashworth earned his doctoral degree in veterinary medicine from Louisiana State University. He directs research and technical nutrition services for the Zinpro RNS beef team worldwide, and Chris also owns and operates a purebred Angus cattle operation. So with that, Chris, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I appreciate you taking the time to spend with us, and I hope we've got some exciting things for you to hear and to utilize in your publications. I think, first of all, let's talk about trace minerals just from an overview standpoint. That is all living things need trace minerals to survive. And I think one of the things that, as far as a need in our industry, is a need to feed mineral on a daily basis. And as a veterinarian, one thing I ask producers oftentimes that they're not feeding mineral year-round for a number of reasons. And I oftentimes come back and ask, what day in an animal's life do they not need mineral? And I think that's the same thing for you and I, as well as other species of farm production animals. The minerals are essential nutrients. They're necessary for growth and development. Later on, they're very necessary for a healthy reproductive tract and a positive reproductive outcome, and then also needed after calving, so that as that animal goes about involuting that uterus and getting that uterus ready for the next calf. I think there's a really huge misperception in the beef cattle industry that forages provide everything that animals need. And at certain times of the year, that's very true, but most of the time, there are deficiencies in one mineral or more. Beef cattle do need optimal trace mineral nutrition every day for all production stages, whether it be during growth as a calf or whether it be in the feed yard. And then finally, feeding the performance trace minerals provides an opportunity to improve beef cattle nutrition in all stages of production, as well as also improving the health of the animal by supporting a very robust immune system. Next. So when we look within the cow-calf sector, reproduction is a driver of profitability. And so longer calving intervals, lower pregnancy rates cause beef cattle operations to be less profitable. And I think, as we come into this coming fall and this coming winter, looking at where feed prices are going to continue to increase probably significantly with what's going on corn production. One of the things is oftentimes producers want to cut back somewhere. Oftentimes they'll look at mineral. And when you look at on a cost per head per day, that's probably one of the least places that they need to be cutting. The other thing is in most cases, or many cases, the cow may not be profitable until about her fourth calf. And so the other aspect of that is one of the keys is to successful profitability is getting that cow bred early and maintaining that shorter calving interval. Next. I think, there's some really interesting data from Texas A&M. Heifers that calve in their first 21 days of the calving season tend to remain early calvers and tend to be a beef producer's most profitable cows. With many beef cow operations having a single weaning date, that means that calves that are born later in the calving season are going to be lighter in weight. And so this is why reproduction is such a driver from an economic standpoint for our cow-calf producers. So if we figure on average the weight advantage of 2 pounds per head per day on calves, a calf born earlier in the cycle is going to end up making significantly more money as compared to a calf that's born at day 60 in a 60-day calving period. Nutrition is going to be key, and that is preparing the cow for the next breeding season is a common challenge for beef producers. Many times even more so for that first calf heifer that is still growing herself, but also has a calf nursing on her, and we need to have the nutrient base and the mineral base there for that ovary to turn over and for that animal to start displaying estrus again. The other thing is a cow's body is going to utilize those nutrients first for maintenance. So once we fulfill maintenance, then we've got other priorities that we're going to utilize nutrients for. Immunity would be one of those. Also growth and growing animals. Then our reproductive animals. Reproduction is going to be the last priority for energy and nutritional resources. So we've got to fulfill all those other needs first for that animal's body before we end up seeing reproduction being achieved. Then finally, anytime that beef cow has poor nutrition status, whether it be in energy or protein or minerals, to deal with those stresses and immune challenges, reproduction will be the first thing that's going to be sacrificed in order to fulfill those other requirements. Next. So nutrition is key. I think one of the things is including performance trace minerals like what's found in our Availafor product is part of beef cow's nutrition that can help them develop into that more efficient, more profitable cow. And so Availafor is one of our product lines. It would be a product containing 4 particular minerals containing zinc, manganese, copper, and cobalt. Zinc is one of those minerals that is utilized in about 350 different systems within the body, whether it be enzymes or hormones that are being produced. Then we have manganese, which plays a very significant role in mitigating inflammation, but also manganese plays a huge role in reproduction, especially at the level of the ovary after ovulation. And then we have copper that plays a number of roles, everything from hoof and horn development, including a tremendous amount of copper is used in different enzyme systems within white blood cells and making those white blood cells work appropriately. And then finally, the cobalt mineral is utilized in the rumen to increase fiber digestion, and specifically around making some of the B vitamins that are made in the ruminant animals. Next. So here is some data looking at where Availafor was used in grazing Breiford cows, looking at both calving interval and pregnancy rate. This was a 3-year study in which we were looking at calving interval, and you can see that the animals on Availafor, from a pregnancy rate standpoint, end up having an increased pregnancy rate over time. And so, and the other thing is you're seeing that the calving interval on animals that were fed the Availafor was less. So meaning that those animals became pregnant again with their second or third calf sooner than animals that were being supplemented with inorganic mineral sources. Next. If we look at conception rates, this is a different study. We're looking at cows were bred AI. And this is specifically where we're looking at 3 different sources of mineral. There was an inorganic level of mineral fed at a low rate, inorganic mineral fed at a higher rate, and finally the Availafor mineral that was being fed. And here you see a difference in the percentage of cows that were bred and confirmed pregnant by artificial insemination. Next. One of the things is we spend a lot of time on reproduction in cows, and oftentimes what gets overlooked is that the importance of mineral for bulls as well, and especially bull development, our purebred registered herds that are providing our seed stock into our commercial cattle herds. This is a study looking at also feeding Availafor, where we were looking at 3 specific sperm characteristics. We were looking at motility, progressive motility, and rapid motility of sperm cells. And in this case, you see the Availafor-fed bulls or increased significantly the motility as well as progressive motility and rapid motility in all 3 of those characteristics. And so this is some data from 2000, it was posted in 2014. And I think that oftentimes we may end up once we pull bulls out of pastures and we've got that defined breeding period, one of the questions I always ask is, do those bulls have continued access to mineral free choice year-round, or are we only supplementing those bulls a few months before the breeding season and maybe while they're with the cows? But once again, we need to look and review our management and make certain that these animals have access to mineral year-round. Next. I think one in the cow-calf operations in particular, weaning is a really stressful time for calves. We still today see a tremendous number of calves that are literally taken off a cow today and sent to the auction market today or tomorrow. I think that from an animal wellness standpoint, animal well-being in the years to come, I think there's going to be a lot more dictated to us by the retail industry on the way that we're managing some of these aspects of cattle management. I think weaning is one of them that's going to probably get some scrutiny. But bovine respiratory disease is a cause of about 50 to 70% of cattle deaths in feed yards each year. And if we consider that the purchase price of a calf, if we assume that to be $900 per head, every time we have a 1% mortality in that group of cattle, we're adding $9 a head to the cost of break even. And that is significant. I think, a study published in 2013 looking at that, the net return was up to $30 per head for cattle that were never treated with BRD, compared to the animals that were treated for BRD with an antibiotic. Those animals ended up losing $45 a head for cattle that received more than 3 treatments. So between not having any BRD being treated and having 3 treatments, the $75 difference in return in that one particular animal. And I think from an economic standpoint alone, as well as we move, society, I would say, moves more and more towards an anti-antibiotic sentiment. I think this is something that producers really need to look at, is how can we significantly increase an immune system, make a better calf that is healthier, I'm going to use the term more resilient in being able to fight off these infections, whether they be bacterial infections or whether they be viral infections. Next, please. So this is some data looking at feedlot during the feedlot growing phase for BRD treatment. And this is actually looking at calves that came from cows that were supplemented during their last trimester only. So basically in this study, cattle, brood cows, were receiving mineral the last trimester. And then from there, we followed those calves out after birth and followed them to and through the feed yard. And when we did, we saw these kinds of results. In the control animals, 42% of those animals were still treated. 59% of animals who came out of dams that were supplemented with sulfate minerals were treated in the feed yard, and only 20% of the calves that came out of brood cows that were fed Avela-4 in the last trimester ended up being treated in the feed yard. And I think this is a good example of where we see that producing a better immune system, having the impact of mineral all the way back when that calf is in utero, and what its impact is all the way out to the feed yard, and how important this is. And so the things that we do to animals while they're in utero, or in this case what we may not have done in treating these animals, makes a difference in how those animals, their entire immune system, and how they end up performing from a health standpoint. And I think this is a good example of where having a good, solid mineral program in place can help reduce bacterial and viral infections. Next. From an immunity standpoint, during weaning, we have data on some of our studies. Average daily gain is improved 9 to 13%. We see morbidity reduced by 45% by having that more robust immune system and better response to vaccines as well. Next. So when we look at weaning weight, and this being a driver of profitability second to reproduction, this is a study we're looking at control animals, inorganic animals, and animals receiving Avela-4. In this particular case, we end up having about a 53-pound difference in these animals that were fed Avela-4 at weaning during the calf growth system. These animals ended up having a 53-pound advantage over animals that were fed a control or an inorganic mineral source. Next. So when we come to challenges in the feedlot, we have that transition stress of weaning, transportation, commingling, new environment, vaccination. Those animals then have to end up being acclimated to a high-energy diet, going from predominantly forage to a predominantly grain-based diet. And then we also have the health challenges that come in. especially respiratory disease, foot rot. And I think the one that we're seeing more and more today in the feed yards across the United States is digital dermatitis or hairy heel warts. And that's another foot-related infection that really has a significant impact on health and a very significant impact on how those animals are going to perform in the feed yard because they hurt so bad in their feet. They're wanting to lie down so much. Next. Then, this is a study looking at feedlot performance and average daily gain and feed conversion. And in this particular case, we see average daily gain increased by 0.2 pounds per head per day. And the feed conversions are decreasing by about a quarter of a pound of feed per pound of gain per day. And so that is very significant. And I think one of the things is sources of minerals do impact the kind of bacteria that are in the gut. We see this with improved feed efficiency when we remove some sulfates from the diet, replacing that with an amino acid complex mineral, and we see increased feed conversions when we do that. And that's the mechanism why that occurs. I think a lot of cattlemen would question, well, why would a mineral impact feed conversion? And that's what is going on, is we're actually changing the bacterial content in the rumen of these animals when we're feeding less sulfates and replacing that with an amino acid complex mineral from Zinpro. Next. So lameness is a major feedlot issue, second only to probably respiratory disease. And this is an issue that we're seeing, as I see personally, as I'm out in feed yards, is we're seeing more and more lameness, unfortunately. And especially this year is wet. We had a very wet fall to begin with. In many parts of the country, we had a wet spring, and having a very wet spring, and it appears like that's going to continue across the Midwestern United States, especially Nebraska, the number one cattle feeding state in the nation. So this refers back to a study from the University of Nebraska, and 5 western feedlots showed 13.1% of animals were treated with a health problem. And of those 13.1%, 16% of those animals had an issue regarding lameness, and 5% of the deaths in the feedlot animals gets back to a lame aspect as well. One thing is lame cattle account for 70% of all the animals that are sold as non-performing animals or as railers. And so one of the things is if we can put some time and effort into preventing lame cattle, we can significantly reduce the number of animals that are going out as railers. The other thing about those railed animals is the price received for those salvaged lame cattle was only 53% of the original purchase price. So now these salvaged animals are sold at a significant loss. And on average, they were sold after being on site in the feed yard for 85 days. So we fed these animals for 85 days. We're receiving only 53% of the original sale price, and yet they only weighed 10 pounds more after having been in the feed yard for 85 days. And so lameness is one of the things that I really strive to have a discussion with the hospital crew and feed yard owners and managers, is what is our incidence of lameness, and what can we do to reduce it, because it plays a significant role in why we have the number of railers that we do coming out of these yards early. Next. So I think, foot rot has, since the 1960s, been an issue within feed yards, and as feed yards have gotten larger, as we have feed yards moving more towards the Midwest, less out of the southwestern part of the U.S., foot rot ends up being more of an issue. And so what we end up seeing is we see a $59 difference this day and age on these overhead losses and loss due to chronically affected cattle, and the cost of treatment for every foot rot incident. I think the other thing that goes on with this is these animals many times have been treated with an antibiotic. So there's also going to be a slaughter withdrawal time before those animals can leave. And so we may not even get those animals completely healed but we have to hold on to them in order to abide by antibiotic withdrawal times. And the next thing you know, they may be still lame at the time that they clear the antibiotic, and by the time they are leaving the operation as a railed animal. And so we have significant amount of data in foot rot. Some of the very early work that Dr. Schugel, the first veterinarian with Zinpro, back in the 70s and 80s, was around foot rot incidents. And so this is a place that zinc in particular and Avelafor has a significant improvement in reducing foot rot by 30 to 57%. Next. So this is I would say, is one of the more new diseases that we're dealing with in feedlot cattle. This is a disease that's been around in the U.S. for 25, 30 years in the dairy industry. It's been in feed yards that have fed Holstein cattle for a long period of time as well. But what we're seeing today is we're now seeing digital dermatitis actually move into our cow-calf herds. And so now we actually have beef calves that are coming out off of the ranch that already have digital dermatitis and are coming into the feed yard. And then that disease condition continues to worsen while those animals are in the pens. And the next thing you know is we have more lameness. And this is a condition that is extremely painful. And so over in the right-hand corner of this slide, you see the bottom of a calf's foot or hoof. And there at the bulb of the heel, you see that red erosion area. And this is just a really extremely painful and sore condition that these animals then end up wanting to lie down more. They get up to eat just enough, and then they want to go back and lie down, because every time they take a step, they're basically moving that heel and making a painful condition. So this is not a whole lot different than if you and I accidentally sliced our knuckle. And, we're moving our fingers all the time, and the next thing you know, you sit there and go, man, that hurts a lot more than you think it would. And so, once again, these animals are extremely painful. The other thing about digital dermatitis is, in my experience, it is commonly misdiagnosed as foot rot. And I think one of the things is we need good lighting in hospital barns. We need to have a method of being able to get those calves into a chute to raise that foot and wash it off and have good lighting in order that we can make the correct diagnosis. So we're using the right antibiotic on those animals to begin with. But more importantly is, what can we do from a mineral standpoint to have the skin and better skin integrity in that foot so that these animals are more resilient and there's less opportunity for them to actually break with clinical disease, is something I think that we need to ask. And that is what's the prevention? What can I do to prevent it, rather than what do I have to do to treat it? Next. So this is a study looking where 54% of steers fed inorganic trace minerals developed digital dermatitis, while only 26% of the steers fed Avela Plus digital dermatitis formula had lesions. And so steers with the lesions had a significant body weight loss of approximately 23 pounds and had a mean reduction in hot carcass weight of 12.1 pounds. And we've had several studies in this area looking at digital dermatitis in feedlot cattle. Next. So, if you look at the average daily gain of lame beef cattle is reduced by 5.5% when compared to sound animals. And so you end up having a difference there of 3.41 pounds versus 3.53 pounds average daily gain. I think the other aspect, the other way I look at this is those lamenesses that are diagnosed in that finishing phase is going to add, on average, 14 additional days on feed for an affected animal. And so this is where the cost is really coming from as well, and that is the additional days on feed to feed that animal to get it to the same weight as herd mates that have already left the feedlot and left through the slaughter facility 14 days earlier. So next. So our feeding recommendation is to feed 7 grams of Zinpro Performance Minerals or Avail-4 per head per day, 365 days a year. And that would be the supplementation that would be coming from our part of the mineral program. Next. So one of the things that we may need to ask is, why are we not using mineral every day? So, one of the reasons is there are logistical challenges. That is, cattle may be grazing really extensive rangeland, and the distance those animals are having to cover for their base operation. The other thing with logistical challenges, for some of our producers who are leasing land from the government on BLM land, there's a lot of regulations of not being able to feed mineral and salt. And part of that is just from an environmental standpoint of having all those animals congregate around a mineral feeder, leading to erosion. So there are times in which cattle producers are not allowed to feed mineral if they're leasing ground from BLM. Other thing is cattlemen, cattlewomen become busy and they're baling hay, and there's other activities going on that take priority, and supplementation is just simply forgotten. And then I think the other thing is a miscommunication that goes back with that busyness, and that is who is responsible for filling mineral feeders on a ranch? I think this is almost like heat detection in a herd that's using artificial insemination. Whose responsibility is it to find cows in heat? Whose responsibility is it to fill mineral feeders? Now, I get onto a lot of cow-calf ranches, and one thing I see mineral that is in a barn on a pallet, but then I also get out to the pastures and I see mineral feeders that are empty. And I look at this, I own cattle myself, my own operation, people that work for me. I look at that is strictly a human issue. That's not an animal issue. And that's something that we need to take care of in order to provide a better living for these animals. And then finally, there's a misunderstanding. That is not all trace minerals are created equal. Inorganic trace minerals do not yield the same performance or the same profitability as performance trace minerals from Zinpro. And so I think that there's that aspect as well. And then I think one thing I'm seeing personally in my own area here, I live just outside Fort Smith, Arkansas. And one thing I'm seeing here is I'm seeing a generational shift right now. Seeing a lot of new younger people coming back with college degrees, coming back to farms and ranches here locally, and they're actually changing the way, changing the management that's ongoing on those operations. Where grandpa never did it, but now you have a son or a new grandson or a new granddaughter that has returned to the operation, and they're looking at things completely differently, and they look at supplementing with mineral as an investment long-term in their cattle and for the health of their animals, and better reproduction, and a better immune system, and hopefully less illness, less sickness to have to treat. Next. So with these results, supplementation should be a priority. We'll review quickly the return on investment of some of these studies that we have already reviewed today. A 15 to 17% higher conception rate, 16-day shorter calving interval, 9% increase in semen motility, 9% increase in progressive motility, and 10% increase in more rapid motility. We end up having and I have just lost my computer. So Greg, at this point, let's open up to questions, and I'll get my computer to wake up here.
Okay. Well, Chris, I do have a couple of questions here, and the first one is, how prevalent is digital dermatitis in beef cattle, and in what geographical areas are you seeing the disease appear?
Well, I think it's going to vary significantly. There's 2 or 3 things that really play a large impact on that. Feed yards that, for whatever reason, haven't cleaned pens out, and we're putting cattle right back in, and we already have a manure and a lot of wetness. We see more digital dermatitis there. Okay, and the other thing is in the feed yards themselves, If you have animals in that pen that are infected, they are spreading the organism in the soil and in the manure. And the longer those cattle are on feed, the higher your prevalence of infections is going to become over time. And so in my experience, let's say if we take lightweight heifers and put them into a feed yard, and they're on feed for 360 days, 380 days, we see a very high prevalence there by the time we get to the end of that situation, because those animals have been exposed to the organism for so many days. If we get into the cow-calf operation, it's significantly less. It may be in 1 to 3% of herds, maybe 5% of herds, but we're seeing that grow, especially as people buy and sell cattle and replacement animals, and that's how they're ending up bringing it back into their operation. And those animals are end up dropping organisms close to water tanks and stock ponds, tanks, etc. I think the other thing is in my experience, in the deep south and southwest Texas, we see a lower incidence of disease because of more sunshine and drier weather and more of a droughted condition. I think we see a lot less of an issue there. Basically, the further north we go, in my experiences, we see the incidence increasing. We will get into pens of cattle that will easily have 30 to 50% incidence over time. I think another big risk factor is if people have fed Holstein steers in the past, and those steers have brought the organism in with them, we end up seeing more in those particular pens as well. And so that would be another aspect that plays a role. So there's several risk factors there. It's not easy just to say a number, but I would say that as we go north, we see an increasing incidence. As we see more wetness, I think as you see this spring how wet it has been. I had a conversation with a man in Iowa today talking about how wet it is. Ohio, I think that we'll continue to see this disease spread. And I do have my computer back up. If you don't mind, I'd like to review the rest of this slide. We do see a 45% reduction in morbidity. We've seen that in our calf study. There's a 9 to 13% increase in average daily gain, a 53-pound increase in weaning weights, and a 42-pound increase in hot carcass weights in a study. We tend to see a 20 to 30% reduction in the incidence of bovine respiratory disease. And one thing that I didn't cover today, some data that we have where feeding minerals, it helps increase the immune response to vaccines. And I think that that's one of the things also is we have probably 40 to, this is a guess on my part, 40 to 50% of the cow-calf herds in the U.S. don't feed any mineral at all. And so we end up having 40 to 50% of calves making it to the feed yard being deficient in most trace minerals. And therefore their immune system just isn't able to respond well when they do, when those calves run into Mannheimia or IBR or BVD. 6% improvement in average daily gain, that 4% improvement we talked about with feed to gain ratio, 30 to 57% decrease in the incidence of foot rot. That's because of feeding zinc and having a better skin condition in those animals, making it more difficult for those bacteria to invade into the skin. And then finally, a 28% reduction in the incidence of digital dermatitis or hairy heel warts. So next. So in the end, organic versus performance trace minerals from Zinpro, the majority of beef cattle producers feed an inorganic trace mineral. Animals cannot optimally function on inorganics alone because of the amount of inorganic minerals that an animal is actually able to absorb is limited through their mechanism of how they are absorbed. Our products being tied to an amino acid complex, our products are absorbed completely differently than the way that a sulfate mineral is absorbed. And that's why we see the performance improvement that we do when producers feed and utilize our mineral products. Next. And so, to wrap up, I want to say there are three distinct varieties. There are inorganic minerals, there are organic minerals, and there are performance trace minerals. And the Zinpro Performance Minerals is a performance trace mineral bound to an amino acid ligand in most instances. And so I think that was there may be one more slide. So I think, there's a lot that goes into healthy, profitable feed operations. We need great genetics. We need well-controlled facilities, hopefully the latest in technology with ideal nutrition. Performance trace minerals can help those beef cattle producers maximize each phase of the operation, whether that be the grow phase for a calf, whether it be the stocker phase, whether it be the feedlot phase, or maybe it's the phase when the brood cow is out on pasture being exposed to the bull, when the bull also is needing mineral year-round as well. And so with that, I think Greg, I'd like to open it up to questions if there are any.
Well, I do have a couple more here, and I'm also let me walk through these here, Chris. The next question is, about halfway through the presentation, you stated that calves from cows fed performance trace minerals had a significant reduction in the incidence of BRD. What our participant wants to know is, how are trace minerals impacting the reduction in the incidence of BRD?
Sure. So when that calf is in utero, that cow is actually pumping mineral across the placenta and pumping mineral into that calf if that cow's being supplemented. So that's how calves on day one, before they even receive colostrum, that's how they would have already received copper, manganese, zinc in their system. And copper, manganese, and zinc, selenium as well, play multiple roles in different parts of the immune system. And so this is where they're making the lymphocytes and the neutrophils, two specific white blood cells in ruminants. And that's where those minerals are playing a role in enzymes that are being created by those neutrophils and lymphocytes. And then those enzymes, that neutrophil is going to eat up or gobble up or phagocytose that bacteria or that virus. And then at that point releases the enzymes within that neutrophil. And that's what actually goes on to help kill whatever bacteria that is. And so that's why in animals this isn't just cattle, this is for you and I as humans as well as other farm animal production species. When you supplement those animals with minerals and vitamins, they have a better immune system that can respond to those challenges, especially whether it be cold stress or heat stress, or whether it be overcrowding, or whether it be weaning, long-haul transportation, all of these different stresses that occur in these animals. That's the mechanism by how we actually reduce the incidence of bovine respiratory disease. And so, if you look, whether it be at cattle or whether it be in you and I, when we break with these bacterial diseases or strep throat, even in a human, the thing is why is that occurring? Well, it's actually occurring because there was a breakdown by the immune system. The immune system failed to get that infection under control when it was a minor infection. That infection continued to go on, became greater and greater, and then eventually becomes to a point that it becomes clinical. So I hope I've answered the question well.
Okay. Chris, we got one more question for you here is, when you were talking about, the challenges of why, beef cattle producers may not be using trace minerals, how can beef cow producers overcome the logistical challenge of feeding trace minerals when the cows are grazing?
Well, I think, most of the time when those cattle are grazing, most of the time they're not being supplemented with other nutritional supplements. They're not being fed every day, in a bunk with a grain supplement. So basically it's going to predominantly be a free choice mineral. that would either be in a mineral feeder or in even a liquid mineral supplement they would be licking off of a mineral wheel. That would be the two most common ways in the cow-calf sector.
Okay. Well, if anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and chat those to me. Otherwise, I just want to, on behalf of Zinpro, we want to say thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned, later this afternoon, I will be sending a copy of the presentation as well as a link to the recording, as well in addition to several assets, graphics that were used in the presentation, as well as some one-page research summaries. We'll have those to you before 5 o'clock today, but we just want to say thank you for joining us. And if you do have any questions, feel free to email me, and I will be happy to get you connected with Dr. Chris Ashworth and answer any questions you might have. Chris, anything else?
No, sir, not if there's no other questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.